If someone had told me 10 years ago, or even 10 weeks ago, that my life would be irrevocably altered by a man with engine grease permanently etched into the lines of his hands, I would have offered them a quiet, pitying smile. My life was a curated collection of silent moments. Predictable. Safe. I didn't come to the city looking for love. I came looking for the quiet anonymity of the archives, a place where the past was neatly cataloged and the future was a series of identical days stretching out before me. My world was built on routine. The 7:15 a.m. alarm. The bitter black coffee brewed in a French press that was my only real indulgence. The walk to the bus stop, where the day's first light would filter through the leaves of the ancient oak tree that marked the corner. Then the bus itself, a rumbling metal cocoon that delivered me to the university campus, where I would spend my day among the dead. Not literally, of course. I was an archivist. I handled the letters and diaries of people long gone, their passions and heartbreaks reduced to brittle paper and faded ink. I was a custodian of forgotten feelings. It was a fitting job for a man who kept his own feelings under lock and key. My evenings were just as structured. The return bus trip, a simple meal for one, eaten while standing at the kitchen counter. And then books. Always books. They were my companions, my confidants, my lovers. They demanded nothing and gave everything. My apartment was a fortress of paper and ink, its walls lined with shelves that groaned under the weight of other people's stories. It was a good life, a quiet life. It was the life I had chosen. And then there was him. He was part of a different routine, one I hadn't consciously created, but had become essential nonetheless. He was the man at the coffee shop, the one I'd stop at on weekends, a small deviation from my weekday austerity. He was always there, leaning against the counter or sitting at the small table by the window, his large frame making the flimsy furniture look like a child's toy. He was, for lack of a better word, monumental, broad-shouldered and tall, with a kind of rugged solidity that seemed to belong to a different era. His hair was dark and always a little too long, curling over the collar of his worn work shirts. His hands. I was fixated on his hands. They were large, calloused, the nails often rimmed with a faint, dark line of grease or dirt that no amount of scrubbing could fully erase. They were the hands of a man who built things, who fixed things. The hands of a man who lived in the physical world, a world I only observed from behind glass. He had a name. Julian. I heard the barista say it once. Julian. It sounded solid, classical. It didn't fit the rough image, and that contradiction fascinated me. He was always alone, but never seemed lonely. He had an easy rapport with the staff, a low chuckle that could cut through the morning chatter. He looked confident, grounded. He looked like everything I was not, and I was almost certain, painfully straight. The way he moved, the way he occupied space with an unapologetic masculinity, the way he would occasionally nod at a pretty woman who walked by. He was a landscape I could admire from a safe distance, a beautiful, dangerous mountain I had no intention of ever trying to climb. He was a story I would never be a part of, a brief, recurring character in the narrative of my weekend mornings, nothing more. The distance between us was more than the few feet of worn linoleum in the coffee shop. It was a chasm. I was a man of quiet observation. He was a man of action. I lived in my head. He lived in the world of engines and steel. We were two different species, drawn to the same watering hole by chance. And I was content with that. Or so I told myself. The day it all changed started like any other Tuesday. The same alarm, the same coffee, the same bus. The sky was a bruised, heavy gray, threatening a storm that had been on the forecast for days. I paid it little mind. My world was indoors. The weather was just background noise. By late afternoon, the background noise had become a roar. The sky opened up. Rain didn't just fall. It assaulted the tall, arched windows of the archive. It came down in sheets, a solid wall of water that blurred the world outside into an impressionist painting of greens and grays. The lights flickered once, twice, then held steady. I continued my work, cataloging the letters of a 19th century botanist, the rhythmic drumming on the roof a soothing counterpoint to the rustle of old paper. When I finally emerged at 6 o'clock, the world had drowned. The campus lawns were shallow lakes. Water surged along the gutters, overflowing onto the sidewalks. My usual path to the bus stop was a running stream. I held my satchel over my head, a useless gesture, and waded through the ankle-deep water, my trousers soaked in an instant. The bus shelter was crowded with other stranded souls, their faces grim. And then the notification pinged on my phone, a death knell for my evening plans. All city bus services suspended due to widespread flooding. Please seek alternative transport. A collective groan went through the small crowd. People started making calls, their voices tight with frustration. I had no one to call. My fortress of an apartment was miles away. Taxis were a myth, all booked or unwilling to brave the submerged streets. I was, for all intents and purposes, stranded. I left the relative shelter of the bus stop and started walking with no real plan. Maybe I could find a hotel. Maybe I could just walk until the rain stopped. My shoes squelched with every step. Cold water seeped into my bones. I was miserable. The rain plastered my hair to my scalp and ran in rivulets down my face, tasting of city grime. I found myself huddled under the awning of a closed bookstore, shivering. The fabric was old and leaking, fat drops of water plopping onto my head with maddening regularity. It was getting dark. The streetlights cast wavering, distorted reflections on the churning water that covered the road. I felt a familiar despair begin to settle in my chest, the cold, heavy weight of being utterly alone. And then, a pair of headlights cut through the gloom. They slowed, approaching my pathetic little shelter. It was an old, dark green pickup truck, the kind that looked like it had survived a war. It rumbled as it stopped beside me, its engine a low growl against the hiss of the rain. The passenger side window rolled down with an electric whine. And there he was, Julian. He leaned across the cab, the faint glow of the dashboard lights carving his face out of the darkness. He looked different without the familiar backdrop of the coffee shop. More real, more intimidating. You look like you could use a ride. His voice was exactly as I'd imagined it would be. A low baritone, rough around the edges, but not unkind. It cut through the sound of the storm. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My brain simply short-circuited. The man from my weekend daydreams was here, in the middle of my weekday nightmare, offering me salvation. It was too absurd. The bus, I stammered, gesturing vaguely at the flooded street. Eloquence had deserted me. He gave a short, humorless laugh. Yeah, I don't think anything's running tonight. Get in. You'll catch your death out here. It wasn't really a question. It was a command, softened by concern. My internal monologue was a screaming chorus of no, don't, it's weird, he's a stranger, but my body was already moving. The cold had seeped too deep. The promise of a dry, warm space was too powerful to resist. I pulled the heavy door open and scrambled inside, dragging a puddle of water in with me. I slammed the door shut, and the roar of the storm was instantly muffled, reduced to a drumming on the roof and a swish of wipers. The sudden quiet was deafening. The cab of the truck was a world unto itself. It smelled of motor oil, damp earth, and something else, something clean and warm, like laundry soap. It smelled like him. I was hyper-aware of everything. The worn fabric of the bench seat, the faint crack in the dashboard vinyl, the stray wrench lying on the floor mat, a coffee-stained travel mug in the cup holder. Thanks, I managed, my voice sounding small and reedy. I risked a glance at him. Up close, he was even more imposing. But the details were different. I could see the fine lines around his eyes, the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw. There was a small, white scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a detail I'd never noticed from across a coffee shop. He looked tired. The easy confidence I always saw was replaced by a kind of weary competence. No problem, he said, putting the truck in gear. Where to? I gave him my address, feeling a strange sense of violation, of giving away a secret piece of my fortified life. He just nodded, his focus on navigating the treacherous street. That's a ways out. We'll see what the roads look like. We drove in silence for a few minutes. The only sounds were the rhythmic squeak of the wipers and the rumble of the engine. I sat ramrod straight, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, my wet clothes cold against my skin. I was intensely aware of the space between us, a gap of maybe 2 feet that felt both immense and terrifyingly small. I stared out the window, watching the flooded cityscape slide by. My reflection was a pale, ghostly superimposed image. A drowned man being chauffeured by a phantom. "You're the guy from the coffee shop, right?" he asked, his voice startling me out of my reverie. "On the weekends." With a book, my heart did a frantic little stutter step. He'd noticed me. He'd noticed the book. My carefully constructed anonymity was a sham. "Yes," I said, my throat suddenly dry. "That's me, Leo," I added, after a beat of silence. "My name is Leo, Julian," he said, though I already knew. He glanced at me, just for a second, and the corner of his mouth ticked up in a small, almost smile. "Figured you were a Leo. Or a Thomas. You look like a book guy." I didn't know how to respond to that. It was an observation, not a judgment, but it felt intensely personal. He had categorized me, filed me away. The book guy. Suddenly, the truck lurched to the side as Julian swerved to avoid a floating trash can. The momentum threw me sideways. My hand, which I'd instinctively put out to brace myself against the dashboard, slipped on the slick vinyl. It landed squarely on his thigh. The world stopped. For one single, solitary second, my palm was pressed against the rough denim of his jeans. I could feel the solid muscle beneath, the radiating warmth of his body. It was like touching a live wire. A jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity shot up my arm, straight to my chest, where my heart exploded like a firework. I snatched my hand back as if I'd been burned, my face flushing with a heat that had nothing to do with the truck's heater. I tucked my traitorous hand under my other arm, hiding it. "Sorry," I whispered, staring fixedly at my own knees. My entire being was focused on that single point of contact. I could still feel the ghost of his warmth on my palm. "It's all right," he grunted, his attention seemingly back on the road. But I saw it. I saw the way his knuckles had gone white on the steering wheel. The muscle in his jaw that clenched just for a moment. The air in the cab changed. The comfortable silence was gone, replaced by something thick and charged. The space between us was no longer empty. It was filled with a humming, vibrant tension. My breath caught in my throat. This was a mistake. Getting in this truck was a terrible, catastrophic mistake. We reached the main thoroughfare that led toward my neighborhood, only to be met with a line of red taillights stretching into the rainy darkness. Up ahead, flashing blue and red lights painted the scene. "Damn it," Julian muttered, leaning forward to peer through the windshield. "Looks like a tree's down." Roads completely blocked, my stomach sank. So close, and yet still so far. "Is there another way?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He was silent for a long moment, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. The rhythmic tapping was the only sound. "There's a back route," he said finally, his voice low and hesitant. "Through the old service roads behind the reservoir. It's not great. Probably half flooded and muddy as hell." He turned to look at me, his gaze serious in the dim light. "I don't love driving it in the best of weather. Hated it as a kid, and there it was. A crack in the facade." The confident, capable man was admitting to a fear, a dislike. It was a small thing, but it felt monumental. It leveled the playing field between us. He wasn't just my rescuer anymore. He was just a man trying to navigate a storm, and he was nervous. "I can help," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "I have my phone. I can pull up the map, help you navigate." My offer hung in the air. I was offering to be his co-pilot, his guide. It was a reversal of our roles. He studied my face for a moment longer, then gave a slow nod. "All right, book guy," he said, a hint of that earlier, faint smile returning. "Let's give it a shot." He executed a deft three-point turn, earning an angry honk from the car behind us, and we headed away from the blocked road into the darker, less traveled parts of the city. The paved streets soon gave way to cracked asphalt, and then to gravel. The rain seemed even heavier out here, away from the city lights. Tree branches scraped against the sides of the truck like skeletal fingers. I held my phone, the glowing map a small beacon of order in the chaos. "In about a quarter mile, there should be a left fork," I said, my voice sounding official, professional. I was playing a role. the helpful navigator. It was easier than being the terrified, flustered man who was acutely aware of the driver's thigh. See it, he confirmed. The road became a muddy track. The truck's tires spun, searching for purchase. Julian's focus was absolute. His hands were steady on the wheel, his jaw set in concentration. He was fighting the road, wrestling the truck through the mud and water. I found myself admiring his skill, the quiet competence with which he handled the massive machine. And then the engine sputtered. It coughed once, twice, and then the steady rumble died, replaced by an unnerving silence. We coasted for a few more feet before the truck's momentum was finally defeated by a particularly deep patch of mud. We came to a stop, tilted at a slight angle. Julian swore a low, vicious sound. He tried the ignition. The engine turned over, whined, but wouldn't catch. He tried again. Nothing. He slammed his fist against the steering wheel. The impact echoed in the small, silent cab. Damn it all to hell, the finality in his voice was chilling. The storm raged outside. The wipers had stopped their rhythmic dance, frozen mid-swipe. The only light came from my phone, its battery at a rapidly dwindling 30%. We were stranded. Truly stranded this time. Not in the city, with the theoretical possibility of a hotel or a taxi, but in the middle of a dark, flooded nowhere in a dead truck. My earlier panic felt like a distant memory, a mild flutter compared to the cold, hard dread that was now setting in my stomach. A stomach full of ice. Julian let out a long, slow breath and leaned his head back against the headrest, closing his eyes. The weariness I'd seen on his face earlier was back, magnified. He looked defeated. "Well," he said, his voice flat, "this is just perfect." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't tense or awkward. It was the silence of shared disaster. We were quite literally in the same sinking boat. I turned off my phone screen to conserve the battery, plunging us into near-total darkness. The dashboard lights had faded to nothing. Only the faintest ambient light from the storm-racked sky filtered through the windows. We were two shadows in a metal box. "I'm sorry," I said, the words feeling inadequate. "I shouldn't have suggested. It's not your fault," he cut me off, his voice still low. "It was either this or sleep in the truck behind a hardware store. This just has a worse view," he paused. "Probably flooded the engine trying to get through that last patch." He sounded like a doctor giving a terminal diagnosis. The mechanic defeated by his own machine. We sat in the dark. The minutes stretched out, marked only by the drumming of the rain. I should have been terrified, and I was on some level, but another, stranger feeling was beginning to surface. A sense of surreal intimacy. The world outside had ceased to exist. There was only the cab of this truck, the sound of the storm, and the presence of the man beside me. "So," he said, his voice startling me, "what kind of books?" "What?" "The books you're always reading." "What kind are they?" The question was so mundane, so normal it was bizarre. Here we were, stranded in a flood, and he was asking about my reading habits. "Oh, history mostly," I said. "Biographies. Old letters. I'm an archivist at the university." "An archivist," he repeated the word slowly, as if tasting it. "So you deal with old stuff?" "Yes. I preserve it. Catalog it. Make sure the stories don't get lost." "Stories," he mused. "You think there are any good stories in an old engine?" I thought about it. I think so. The places it's been, the people it's carried, the times it broke down, and the person who had to fix it. I think everything has a story." He was quiet for a moment. "Never thought of it like that. To me, it's just a collection of parts. You learn how they fit together, what they do when they break. It's a puzzle. I like puzzles," I admitted. And just like that, we were talking. The conversation flowed easily, hesitantly at first, then with more confidence. He asked about my job, and he actually seemed interested. He didn't get that glazed-over look people usually did when I mentioned archival science. He asked what the oldest thing I'd ever held was. I told him about a 16th-century merchant's ledger, the ink still dark, the paper like silk. I, in turn, asked him about his work. He owned a small garage on the industrial side of town. He specialized in classic cars, restoring them. His hands, the ones I had been so fascinated by, were his livelihood. He spoke about carburetors and transmissions with the kind of poetry I usually reserve for literature. He was passionate about his work in a way I deeply understood. The storm, the dead truck, the darkness, it all faded into the background. We were just two people sharing our small, specific worlds. "I see you at the coffee shop," he said, his voice dropping a little. It was a confession. "You're always there in that same corner booth. You always look so focused, like you're a million miles away." My heart did that stutter step again. He didn't just notice me. He'd observed me. He'd thought about me. The darkness gave me a strange, unearned courage. The words were on my tongue before I could stop them. "I notice you too," I said, my voice barely a whisper. More than I probably should, the confession hung in the air between us, heavy and fragile. I had said it. I had taken the vague, unspoken thing that lived inside my head and given it voice. I held my breath, waiting for the inevitable recoil, for the awkward laugh, the shift away from me, the sudden chill. But it didn't come. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of my words. I could feel him looking at me in the dark. I could feel the shift in his breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick. "Leo," he just said my name. But the way he said it, it was a question and a statement all at once. It held a universe of unspoken things. He moved, a rustle of fabric in the dark. He turned on the bench seat, his body angled toward me. I could feel his proximity as a physical heat, a magnetic pull. My own body felt frozen, pinned in place by a mixture of terror and a desperate, aching hope. "Can I?" he started, then stopped. The words failed him. He didn't need them. He leaned in, slowly, cautiously. It was the slowest movement I had ever witnessed. It gave me an eternity to pull away, to say no, to shatter the moment. I could feel his breath, warm and smelling faintly of coffee, before I felt anything else. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was a statue, waiting for a lightning strike. And then his lips touched mine. It wasn't a frantic, passionate kiss like in the books I read. It was hesitant, questioning. His lips were soft, a little chapped. It was a gentle pressure, a simple meeting of skin. But it was the most profound thing I had ever experienced. It was a question. "Is this okay?" My entire body shuddered with the answer. I leaned into him a fraction of an inch, and that was all the encouragement he needed. The pressure deepened. His hand came up, not to grab me, but to gently cut my jaw, his thumbs stroking softly against my cheek. The callous skin was an abrasive, wonderful shock against my own. It was a kiss of pure, unadulterated honesty. There was no artifice, no performance. It was just this, him and me, in the dark, in a storm. The world had shrunk to the space between our mouths. My mind, usually a raging torrent of anxieties and what-ifs, went blessedly, beautifully silent. There was only the feeling, the warmth, the impossible reality of it. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing heavily. He didn't pull away completely. His hand was still on my face, his forehead resting against mine. "Leo," he whispered again, his voice hoarse. It sounded like a prayer. I couldn't form words. I could only feel the frantic, trapped bird of my heart beating against my ribs, finally free. The rest of the night passed in a surreal haze. We talked more, our voices low and intimate in the dark. We kissed again, more confidently this time, exploring a new and fragile language. At some point, exhausted, I must have drifted off, my head resting against his shoulder, the scent of him a comforting anchor in the dark. I woke to the jarring sound of a heavy engine and the flash of yellow lights. A tow truck. Morning had broken, a weak, gray light filtering through the rain-streaked windows. My neck was stiff and I was cold. I was leaning against Julian, who was already awake, talking in low tones to a man outside his window. The spell was broken. The journey back to my apartment was a blur of awkward silence. The sun was trying to break through the clouds. The city was emerging, blinking, from its watery ordeal. The intimate darkness of the truck cab had been replaced by the harsh, unforgiving light of day. What had seemed so real, so inevitable in the storm-tossed night, now felt like a dream, a fantasy. I sat beside Julian, the ghost of his lips still on mine, and felt a chasm opening between us again. He was focused on the road, his jaw tight. The easy intimacy of a night was gone, replaced by a rigid formality. He pulled up in front of my apartment building. It looked so normal, so mundane. It belonged to my old life, the one before the storm. "Well," he said, not looking at me. "Here you are." My heart plummeted. This was it. The polite dismissal. "Thank you," I said, my voice hollow. "For the ride." "For everything, don't mention it." He still wouldn't look at me. His hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. I fumbled with the door handle, desperate to escape the sudden, crushing awkwardness. "I'll see you around," he said to the windshield. It was a dismissal, the kindest one he could manage, but a dismissal all the same. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me, and practically fell out of the truck. I slammed the door and didn't look back. I walked to my apartment building on unsteady legs, the sound of his truck pulling away echoing behind me like a final, slamming door. Inside my apartment, the silence was deafening. My fortress. It no longer felt safe. It felt empty. I leaned against the door, the scent of his truck, of him still clinging to my damp clothes. And the spiral began. It was a mistake. The thought was a cold, sharp spike in my gut. He was stranded, it was dark, he was vulnerable. It didn't mean anything. He was straight. He had to be. This was a fluke. A moment of crisis-induced confusion. He was probably, at this very moment, driving away as fast as he could, trying to scrub the memory of my mouth from his. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on me, stealing my breath. I stripped off my damp clothes and stood under a scalding hot shower, trying to wash away the night. Trying to wash away the feel of his hand on my jaw, the memory of his lips. But it was useless. The feelings were branded onto my skin, etched into my memory. I had been a fool. I had let a crack of light into my carefully sealed world, and now the darkness felt darker than ever before. The book guy. That's all I was. A weird, brief chapter in his life he would probably try to forget. The next day, I broke my weekend-only rule. I needed to know. I walked to the coffee shop, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I stood outside, peering through the window. The corner table was empty. He wasn't there. Of course he wasn't there. The day after that, he wasn't there either. The silence was his answer. It was a confirmation of all my worst fears. The absence of his green truck, the emptiness of his usual spot by the counter, was a physical ache in my chest. My old solitude, once a comfortable blanket, was now a hair shirt, scratching and irritating. It was tainted by the ghost of his presence, the echo of his voice. I retreated. I buried myself in the archives, working late, losing myself in the passions and pains of people a century dead. It was easier to handle their emotions than my own. I went back to my routine, clinging to it like a life raft. But the structure was hollow. The silence of my apartment was no longer peaceful. It was lonely. Every corner held a memory of a life I had almost, for one night, touched. For days after the storm, for days of agonizing silence, I was sitting in my living room, staring at a book I hadn't managed to read a single page of. The story in my head was too loud. Then a knock on my door. My blood ran cold. No one ever knocked on my door. It had to be a delivery, a neighbor. It couldn't be. I opened the door a crack, my heart pounding in my throat. It was him, Julian. He stood in the hallway, looking as out of place as his truck would on my quiet residential street. He looked terrible, exhausted. There were dark circles under his eyes. He wasn't wearing his work clothes, just jeans and a plain gray t-shirt that stretched across his chest. He was holding something, a book, a slim paperback. We just stared at each other for a long moment. He looked as nervous as I felt. "Hi," he said, his voice rough. Ivrata. Can I?" He gestured vaguely toward my apartment. I stepped back, pulling the door open wider. He walked in, his large frame seeming to shrink the space of my small living room instantly. He looked around, at the towering shelves of books, his gaze lingering on them. "This is your place," he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, an awkward silence fell. He was still holding the book, his knuckles white. He finally broke the silence. "I'm sorry," he said, looking at the floor, "for just disappearing. That was a shitty thing to do." I just shook my head, unable to speak. I freaked out, Leo, he said, his voice low and raw. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a desperate, startling vulnerability. I have never in my life felt like I felt in that truck with you. And it scared the hell out of me. The dam inside me broke. The relief was so immense, so overwhelming, it felt like pain. He wasn't disgusted. He was scared. I got in my truck the next morning, he continued, his words tumbling out now, and I just drove. I didn't know where I was going. I ended up at the coast. I just sat there, watching the ocean, trying to get my head straight. He took a breath. I wasn't running away from you because I regretted it. I was running because I was terrified of how much I didn't regret it, how much I wanted. More of it. He looked at me, his expression pleading. I've never been with a guy, Leo. I've never even thought about it. Not really. And then you. And that night. It's like the whole world tilted on its axis. I didn't know what to do with it. With this, he gestured between the two of us. My own fear, which had been my constant companion for days, finally receded enough for me to speak. I thought you hated me, I whispered. I thought it was a mistake, that you were just confused by the storm. A pained look crossed his face. No, God, no. It wasn't the storm. It was you. He stepped closer, closing the small distance between us. I was an idiot. I should have called. I should have. I don't know. I'm not good at this stuff. At talking, me neither. I admitted, a watery smile touching my lips. He held out the book he was carrying. It was a collection of poetry by Walt Whitman. I was in a bookstore out on the coast, he said, his cheeks flushing slightly. And I saw this. And it made me think of you. The book guy, I took it from him. My fingers brushed his, and this time, neither of us pulled away. The small spark was still there, but now it was a gentle warmth, not a shocking jolt. I've never really read poetry, he admitted. Maybe I could read some to you sometime. I offered, my voice shaking slightly. His eyes softened. I'd like that. He paused, and his expression turned serious again. Leo, I don't know what this is or where it's going. All I know is that the last 4 days without you have been worse than being stranded in that damn truck. He took another step, so close now I could feel the heat radiating from his body. Can I stay? For a little while. It was another question, hanging in the air, but this time it wasn't about a kiss. It was about something more. It was about letting him into my fortress, not as an invader, but as a guest. As a beginning, I opened the book he'd given me. On the inside cover, in a rough, blocky script, he had written his phone number. A tangible promise. A connection that wouldn't be washed away by the morning light. Yes, I said, my voice clear and steady for the first time in days. Stay, and he did. The weeks that followed were a quiet revelation. Julian's green truck became a familiar sight, parked on my street. His presence began to fill the empty spaces in my apartment, in my life. It started with him staying for dinner, then leaving a toothbrush in my bathroom, then a change of clothes in my closet. My fortress of one slowly, carefully, began to accommodate too. The mornings were the most profound change. I used to wake up to silence. Now I woke up to the sound of him breathing beside me. I would lie there in the early morning light and watch the rise and fall of his chest, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead. The sight filled a space in my heart I never knew was empty. Our routines began to merge. We would have coffee together, me with my bitter black brew, him with 2 sugars and a splash of milk. Sometimes I'd go to his garage after work. I'd sit on a stool, surrounded by the organized chaos of his tools, and read while he worked. I learned the different sounds of his labor, the sharp clang of a wrench, the low hum of a sanding tool, the satisfying roar of a newly revived engine. He, in turn, learned the rhythms of my quiet world. He would sit on my sofa in the evenings, not talking, just being present while I lost myself in a book. He'd trace the lines of my face with a grease-stained finger, his touch a grounding presence that kept me from drifting too far away. He never pretended to understand the appeal of a 200-year-old letter, but he respected my passion for it. He respected my world. We were an unlikely pair, the archivist and the mechanic, the man of words and the man of action. But in the quiet spaces of my apartment, we found a common language. It was a shared look across the room, It was in the comfortable silence of two people simply existing together. It was in the way he would pull me close in the middle of the night, his solid warmth a bulwark against any storm. One Saturday morning, months later, we were at the coffee shop. Our coffee shop. We were sitting at my old table, the corner booth. He was reading the sports section of the paper, and I was reading the book of poetry he'd given me. It felt so normal, so beautifully, wonderfully mundane. He reached across the table and took my hand, his callous palm enveloping mine. He didn't say anything, just gave my hand a gentle squeeze, his thumb rubbing circles on my skin. It wasn't a secret gesture in the dark. It was here, in the light of day, in our place. A simple, public act of ownership, a belonging. I looked at him, at the man who had once been a distant, impossible landscape, the man who had rumbled into my life in a storm and refused to leave. He caught my eye over the top of his newspaper and gave me that small, rare smile that was reserved just for me. My life was no longer a fortress. It was a home. The quiet was still there, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was the quiet of contentment, of shared space, of not needing to be alone to feel at peace. Julian was the plot twist I never saw coming. He was the disruption, the chaos, the storm that had wrecked my predictable little life. And in the wreckage, we had built something new, something stronger, something that had a story all its own, a story that was still just beginning. I had spent my life cataloging the past, but he, this solid, warm, beautiful man, he was my future. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it.